My name is Andreas, and I am 31 years old. On the surface, I look like a completely ordinary man, not particularly tall, maybe 75 centimeters, a bit too slim for my own taste, and with a tendency to look tired because I work way too much. I have light brown hair, always a bit messy because I rarely have the energy to fix it in the morning. I live in a small town in the USA, one of those places people often just pass through on their way to something bigger, but which I find charming. Here, people recognize faces in the grocery store, and there's always a neighbor who greets you when you take out the trash. I haven't been very lucky in love. My first girlfriend, Hannah, betrayed me after 2 years. I came home early from work one afternoon and found her in our shared apartment with another man, an older guy she claimed she was working with, pounding her from behind over the backrest of our sofa. I remember not saying a word, just taking my keys and leaving. It took months to emotionally recover from that breakup. My next relationship was no better. Sarah, a vibrant, artistic soul who promised me she was different. And she was different, but the infidelity still came, this time through subtle texts and strange disappearances in the evenings. Eventually, she admitted that she had been having an affair for over half a year with a childhood friend who had come to visit. I left her without any drama. After two painful betrayals, I was convinced that love might not be for me. I started living a more withdrawn life, focused on work, got into my hobbies, some photography, many walks in the woods, some reading late at night. But then, one June evening 4 years ago, I met Elin. Elin was completely different from the women I had been with before. She wasn't particularly tall, maybe 160, had short chestnut brown hair, and a look full of life. We met at a lecture on sustainable farming. I was there mostly because my colleague wanted some company, and she was there because she claimed she wanted to start a small kitchen garden. Afterwards, we started talking, by chance really, about the speaker's views on local produce. I remember how her eyes lit up when she talked about her plans, how she wanted to be self-sufficient in vegetables one day, how she was trying to reduce plastic in her everyday life. I was fascinated, and soon we were sitting at a nearby cafe, drinking tea and talking until the staff closed for the night. Elin had lived a tougher life than I could have imagined. She told me early on that she had struggled with addictions, both alcohol and harder drugs. When I met her, she had been sober for over 2 years. I was impressed by her strength, her willingness to turn her life around for something better. She worked as an assistant at an advertising agency, a job she didn't love, but which provided her with stability. She exercised often, running in the mornings to stay focused and clear. When she talked about her past struggles, she didn't shine with shame, but with a kind of proud determination. She had come out of the darkness and was now looking forward. I don't drink alcohol myself, I don't smoke, and drugs have never even been near my life. Maybe that was part of the attraction for her. I represented stability, calm, and security. At the same time, I admired her for daring to face her demons. Together, we felt like a couple that complemented each other. She had a confidence that was infectious, a spark I had missed in my previous relationships. Years went by, and each day with Elin made me a little stronger. She treated me well. I was a calm, thoughtful person, but with her, I dared to laugh louder, dared to talk more about my dreams and fears. She encouraged me to apply for that new job I had been hesitant about, to dare to buy a better camera for my photography, to travel a bit spontaneously when vacation time came. She introduced me to her friends, and for the first time, I felt like a natural part of someone else's world. We never fought. It might sound unlikely, but we had hardly any conflicts. I'm the type who likes to back down if I sense a fight is brewing. I had decided that I didn't want to repeat my previous mistakes. No yelling, no drama, no constant questioning. And Elin seemed satisfied with that. She was the one who took the initiative, and I followed. I don't like conflicts, so when she thought we should buy a special bed or paint the living room a certain color, I agreed. She got to make most of the decisions, and I accepted them without fuss. It never felt like a sacrifice, rather like a way for me to show my love, letting her shape our shared life in a way that made her happy. About 10 months ago, we found out that Elin was pregnant. I remember that day so clearly. She came home from work, a bit tense, a bit nervous. I was sitting at the kitchen table, having just taken out a pot of pasta. She sat across from me and took my hand. Her eyes were a bit glossy, and she showed me the test strip. "I'm pregnant, Andreas," she said. I was speechless at first. I was overjoyed, but also so scared. Scared of the responsibility that would come, but mostly scared of losing the perfect balance we had. But the joy outweighed it. We hugged for a long time, and I could almost feel life changing in that moment. That's when a new phase in our relationship began. We chose names both for a boy and a girl. We bought small clothes, counted the weeks, and went to ultrasound examinations. Elin was composed and calm. I was more excited than I had ever been. The thought of a child made me feel whole in a way, as if my life finally had a clear direction. With Elin by my side and a child on the way, it felt like nothing could stop us. It was a Tuesday when everything collapsed. I had thought the baby would come before the weekend. So be it, at least according to the estimated due date. But on Tuesday, Elin called from the hospital. She sounded breathless and worried. "The water broke, Andreas," she said. I remember hesitating for a moment. I was at work and had a meeting planned, but I dropped everything, told my boss I had to go. My colleagues wished me luck. I jumped into the car and drove to the hospital, my heart pounding hard in my chest. When I arrived at the delivery ward, I was shown into a room. Elin was lying in the bed, tired, but still with a glimmer in her eye. And there, in the same room, stood a man I had never seen. He was straight-backed, broad-shouldered, with long dark hair, a big beard, tattoos along his arms, and a piercing in one eyebrow. I am quite ordinary in appearance myself, and this man was my complete opposite. I didn't even have time to ask who he was before he greeted me. "Hey, I'm Rasmus." I nodded awkwardly, trying to understand why he was there. I felt my stomach tighten, but I tried to keep my composure. I walked over to Elin, smiled gently, and tried to focus my gaze on our child lying in a small plastic bin beside us. A little boy, red and wrinkly, beautiful and fragile. I already felt love for this little life. I noticed that Elin wasn't really meeting my gaze. Instead, she asked Rasmus to leave. "Can we have a moment?" she said, and he nodded, gave me a brief glance, and left the room. Now that we were alone, I couldn't hold back the questions. Who is he? Why is he here? But Elin just looked me in the eyes, and before I could finish the question, she dropped a bomb. "Andreas, I need to tell you something. This boy, he's not yours. I've been seeing Rasmus for almost a year now, and he's the father." Everything fell apart. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was in a vice. I had been living in an illusion for so long. She explained with a strange coldness in her voice that she had wanted to hope until the end that the child was mine. But now that she knew, she couldn't deceive me anymore. "I don't want to drag you through all this," she said. "I want to be honest. You haven't done anything wrong. I just like Rasmus. He and I, it turned out like this." I thought I would scream, hit, fight. But I did none of that. I stood there silently, feeling the floor shake. My world, my life, my future, everything was gone. Somehow I ended up there. I don't quite remember how. I think I just walked out of the room, walked through the white hospital corridors, past the nurses, through the main entrance of the hospital, and out onto the street. I went to my car, drove home. There at home was the crib in the corner of our bedroom, ready for a baby that wasn't mine. We separated shortly after. Elin moved out and took her things. I packed the baby clothes into a box and donated them. Seeing the little bodies I had picked out myself in a store a few months earlier burned like fire in my chest. I didn't know how I would move forward. Part of me just wanted to lie down and never get up again. In the following weeks, I tried to understand, how can a person who seems so strong and loyal do something like that? She had given me hope for a future, for a family. I tried calling her one evening, but when she answered, I couldn't get a word out. I heard her breathing on the line, but said nothing. So I hung up. What did I have to say? What could she say that would make me feel better? I sought advice, not openly, but anonymously online. I read forum threads, stories from others who had been cheated on. I realized I wasn't alone, that infidelity happens everywhere, even in the most perfect relationships. But it didn't help. I loved Elin so much. I would have taken her back, so weak was I. If she had knocked on my door and said, "I'm sorry, it was a mistake," I'm afraid I would have fallen into her arms immediately. But she didn't come. Instead, I found out through a mutual acquaintance that she and Rasmus had moved in together in a small apartment across town. I tried not to think about it, tried not to imagine them together, with the child who was now his. Months went by. I tried to return to my life. I worked extra hard, took on more projects. I photographed in the woods. I took long walks. I felt empty inside, but life doesn't stand still. My rental was still the same. I still had my bills to pay. My colleagues sometimes asked how I was doing, but I gave them stiff smiles and vague answers. "I'm fine. I'm okay." Nothing was true, but I didn't know what else to say. Then one evening, maybe 3 months after the breakup, Elin suddenly stood outside my door. I hadn't expected it. I opened it and saw her there, her hair tied up in a bun, wearing a simple coat. Her eyes looked tired. "Andreas, can we talk?" she asked. I wanted to close the door, ask her to leave, but I let her in anyway. My heart was pounding twice as hard. There we were in my living room, sitting across from each other. She took a deep breath. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I know it doesn't mean much, but I regret hurting you so much. I don't know what came over me. I thought I needed something else, something more exciting. Rasmus and I thought it would make me happy." I looked at her. For 4 years, she had been my world. Now she was sitting here apologizing, but it felt too late. "Why?" was all I could get out. She shrugged, tears streaming down her cheeks. I was scared that life would become boring, that everything was too predictable. I felt suffocated, like we already knew how the rest of our lives would be. I was looking for a thrill. She admitted that she knew it was wrong, but she couldn't stop once she started. I felt anger, sadness, confusion. But most of all, I felt nothing. It was as if all my love for her had been on the ground and had now been washed away by rain. I told her to leave. She cried, tried to hug me. I sat stiff as a board and let her cry. When she realized I wouldn't soften, she stood up, sniffled out a "I'm sorry," and left the apartment. Afterwards, I sat on the couch for a long time, just breathing, maybe a small step forward. Now I at least knew she regretted it. But I didn't know if it mattered. The wounds were too deep. I had lost my future with her, the future I thought we had. I started going to therapy. I realized I needed to talk to someone outside about all this. The psychologist, an older woman with a soft voice, listened patiently as I talked about my previous relationships and how I had always adapted to avoid conflicts. "You have the right to take up space in your own life," she said once. "Just going along with everything to keep the peace can lead to losing yourself." Maybe that was part of the problem. I had a lot to think about. Elin was gone, but I realized I had an opportunity to build something new within myself. I had to come to terms with my own patterns, with my own fear of conflicts, with my inability to set demands. I had been so busy pleasing others that I hadn't even noticed if my partner was truly happy or if she was longing to leave. Winter came, dark and cold. I went to work, came home, cooked, continued with therapy. Slowly, I began to feel like I was regaining a part of myself. I dared to say no a bit more often at work when the boss piled on too much. I called an old friend and openly talked about what had happened. He listened and we decided to meet for a coffee. I had been isolating myself for a long time, but realized I needed people around me. Sometimes the memories surfaced. I remembered how Elin and I had walked along a beach one summer evening, how we talked about the future, maybe buying a house, maybe traveling more. I remembered how proud I had been of her overcoming her addiction, and I also remembered how little we had actually discussed problems. We had had an almost unrealistically calm relationship, but maybe the calm was an illusion. Maybe the storm had been brewing beneath the surface while I closed my eyes. After a few more months, on a spring day when the light returned, Elin called again. I hesitated, but answered. She sounded nervous. "I just want to meet you one last time, Andreas. I want to explain myself. I felt that I might need it, I needed closure, a chance to look her in the eyes and understand what had happened, and also to make it clear to myself that I needed to move on. We met at a cafe in the city center. She was alone. No stroller, no Rasmus. She looked different, a bit more worn, or maybe just more human than I remembered her. We ordered our coffees and sat at a window table. She explained that her relationship with Rasmus hadn't turned out as she had thought. I thought he would give me excitement, but it became more chaos than anything else. He was unreliable, drank a lot, and wasn't exactly ready to be a father. They argued. She felt lonely. She had imagined a life filled with passion, but instead she found herself more insecure than ever. I listened silently. Part of me felt schadenfreude, but a larger part of me felt only sadness. "Why are you trying to say this to me?" I asked. She looked down into her cup. "Because I realized that I was happy with you, and I wonder if you can ever forgive me, if we can try again." My heart raced. The one I had once loved, the one who had broken me, was now asking for a second chance. I wanted to scream that she had destroyed my life, that she had taken everything beautiful and trampled on it. I wanted to throw my coffee cup against the wall, but instead I took a deep breath. I thought about what the psychologist had said, about my own patterns. I thought about how I now knew that I wasn't obliged to be comfortable and constantly agreeable. I had the right to express how I felt. "Elin," I said, "I loved you. I thought we would have a child together, a life. You betrayed me in the most unimaginable way. And then you came with your excuses. But that doesn't change what happened. I can't just forget. I can't pretend everything is okay and go back to how it was." She cried. I could see her lips trembling. "I understand," she said. I regret it so much. I mourned what we had lost, but I knew I didn't want to live with constant suspicions and fear of another betrayal. I didn't want to be her security blanket, which she could pull out when it suited her. I stood up and placed some bills on the table. "I hope you find your way, Elin, but I can't be a part of it anymore." She tried to take my hand, but I pulled away. "Andreas, please," she began. I shook my head. "Too late," I just said. Then I turned around and left the cafe. Outside on the street, the sun was shining. I took a deep breath and walked towards the park. I felt relieved and at the same time heavy. Relieved because I had finally said what I needed to say, that I no longer cowered from conflict. Heavy because the love was truly over, because the dream of a life with her had burst like a soap bubble. The weeks after that meeting felt strangely peaceful. I thought less about her. I focused on work, on my friends, on my own development. I started taking pottery classes in an evening course, just to try something new. I spent weekends hiking in the woods and trying to capture the early morning light with my camera. I stopped comparing myself to Rasmus in my head, stopped wondering why Elin did what she did. I realized that sometimes there are no perfect explanations. People are flawed, and sometimes they betray us. One spring morning, I walked along a small gravel road by a lake. The sun was gently rising over the treetops. Birds were singing. I thought about my life. It had almost been that I had let Elin's betrayal define me. But now I saw it as part of my story, not my entire future. I didn't have to be the man who never stood up for himself. I could become someone who acknowledged his own needs, who set boundaries, who was open to love but not willing to sacrifice himself to please others. I met new people. I smiled at the neighbor in the stairwell, talked to a colleague I had never taken the time to before. I began to feel that life was out there beyond my pain, that I could shape a new path forward. I also opened up more in therapy. I dared to talk about my own background, about my childhood and why I might have become so conflict averse. There were deeper roots to my behavior, and by understanding them, I could start to change. Months passed and I received a new job offer that involved more creative freedom. I accepted it. I moved to an apartment with better lighting, a two-bedroom with a balcony where I could grow herbs and flowers. When I stood there on the balcony one late afternoon, with a cup of tea in hand, I felt free. It wasn't the freedom of silence from sorrow, but the freedom of choices. Sometimes I wondered how Elin was doing. If Rasmus had stayed, or if she was alone. If she had gotten her life together, or if she had fallen into a destructive spiral. I guess part of me still cared about her, Not because I wanted her back, but because she had been an important part of my life once upon a time. But I heard nothing from her, and I felt no need to find out more. It was a story that was over, a door that had closed behind me. One evening, I took out my diary, an old notebook I sometimes wrote in when I needed to sort out my thoughts. I read through notes from when Elin had just moved into my life. How in love I had been, how hopeful. Then I read notes from the time after the betrayal, how empty I felt, how furious, and at the same time paralyzed by shock. I could see my own journey on the pages, like a curve that first rose towards a sky of hope, then plummeted into a valley of despair, and was now on its way up to a more stable plateau. I took a pen and wrote, "Today I truly left her, within myself. Today I stopped hoping she would come back. Today is the beginning of something new." I became increasingly convinced that my last meeting with Elin had been necessary. It was the point where I formulated my own feelings without fear. Maybe it was the first time in our 4 years together that I clearly set my own boundaries. The irony wasn't lost on me. It took an enormous betrayal for me to discover my own voice. Life went on. I met a woman in my pottery class, Johanna. She was calm, a bit shy, but laughed at my bad jokes. We talked about our lives. She had left a destructive relationship a year ago and was now trying to find herself again by creating things with her hands. I didn't see any romantic undertones right away, but it was nice to have someone to talk to without preconceived notions, without baggage. Just two people who had made mistakes, been hurt, but still wanted to live. When summer came, I had found a new routine. I got up earlier in the mornings, ran a short lap, showered, and had a better breakfast. I biked to work, enjoyed the smells and colors. I returned home, watered my herbs on the balcony, cooked simple but good meals. Small things, but they shaped a reality where I was no longer defined by betrayal. I wasn't the cheated man, but just Andreas, with my interests and my new life. I thought back to the child that wasn't mine. It was perhaps the most painful thought. I had really looked forward to becoming a father, but now I saw it differently. I had lived in a lie. The child had never been mine, and it was better that it came out then than 10 years later. I just hoped that the boy would have a good life, despite the chaotic start he had received. Sometimes I dreamed about Elin. In the dreams, we were back in our apartment. Everything was peaceful. We were waiting for the child. She smiled at me. But when I woke up, I felt no loss. I understood that the dreams were my brain's way of processing memories. In reality, I had left it behind. I remember our last conversation at the cafe when she asked me to try again. How I stood up and left. How I finally refused to set myself aside. It was the moment when I truly left her, not just physically but emotionally. In the same moment, I also left my old role, the role of always accommodating, always afraid of conflict. I understood that love without respect wasn't love, and that to be truly loved, you had to dare to be yourself, dare to say no when something hurt. Now, looking back on everything, I realize that the journey I have made has been painful but necessary. I had met a woman who gave me hope for the future, but who ultimately proved incapable of being faithful. She broke my heart, and in the cracks of that broken heart, a new insight grew, that I needed to stand up for myself. I also understood that people change, that it's not always possible to predict how love will develop. But above all, I learned that my worth is not measured by how well I can adapt to someone else's whims. Summer turned to late summer, the air became milder, and the evenings longer. I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea, watching the sun set behind the rooftops. I felt a kind of gratitude despite everything. Gratitude that life goes on, that pain can be transformed into strength, that I could finally leave her, not with hate, but with a determination not to return to something that no longer fit into my life. I now knew that it was possible to love someone deeply and then leave them if love had been poisoned by betrayal. I knew that I could survive it, and with that realization, I felt free. This story has no fairy tale ending. I don't encounter fireworks on my path, no fantastic new love that immediately fills the void. Instead, I find peace in being alone for the moment, in getting to know myself anew. I have realized that as a man, you must learn to find peace in solitude. Once you have found inner peace, You can take on more responsibility and perhaps a partner, but you must have your shit together beforehand, so to speak.
If you liked this story, please subscribe and give us a thumbs up. It helps a lot, and you won't miss out on any future stories. Take care and live your best life.